why suddenly at the turn of the 20th century did all of these artists, especially in Europe, but also in America, just suddenly make this radical break. And I didn't really find that I could get, I didn't really get very satisfactory answers. And this is like, again, this is like, 2 decades ago or something, right? So it's like the internet wasn't what it was. The idea that I would just Google it really wasn't there. I didn't even know what I was searching for.
Wow.
And so what eventually would happen is just the reading, I learned about the Bauhaus, learned about Kandinsky, and then every now and then I would see these phrases and somebody would say, oh, well, Kandinsky was a theosophist. And then that would be the end of it. And there'd be no explanation.
No more. Just
no
cut it off right there.
And I was just like, what is going on with this? And so, through a long series of processes, I eventually end up moving down to Los Angeles. And, one day I'm trying to, I have to go to mail an overnight package. And like the last possible place I can go is south of downtown. And I go there, and directly across the street, there's this huge building, and it says across the front of the building, Theosophy Hall. And I was like, that can't possibly be what that is, because that doesn't exist anymore, right? Like this is something from the past. And so then that really led, but I knew that this was somehow related to what these artists had been motivated by. So that really led then to me eventually going in and basically like almost a decade of study with that particular group.
Cool.
And to kind of just like unpack, like, I was like, oh wait, this is what all of these artists were being motivated by. These are the ideas that these people were inspired and they were really passionate about. So what is this? It wasn't even like so much a matter of like how I would have understood it as like a spiritual process, or about even my own coming to an understanding of spirituality, because that wasn't even the question. It was just like, what is this? Like what is this? And why, in the context of arts education and art history, why is it that I never hear about this if it was clearly so important? So that, that's kind of how it really starts to open up, that then leads to everything that happened since then.
Wow. That's such like a sort of a serendipitous, or like almost like synchronistic moment. Like you had been thinking, someone had like planted a seed of just even the word theosophy. And then you, all of a sudden it comes into your life in like a tangible way in this building. And that just sort of catalyzed your whole journey from where you are. I just think moments like that, when I hear stories that are so miraculous and special, the way that like one little moment can just totally like veer you in a whole new direction of interest and exploration that really defines a lot of who you're becoming and who you've become, this path that you're on. I'm curious, as you started to study theosophy, like just for some of our listeners out there who might have similarly heard this term before, but don't really understand what theosophy is or was, can you maybe explain a little bit about like what it is you were studying and sort of how theosophy fits in sort of the framework of philosophical traditions that other people might be aware of? I think that context could be important in this conversation today.
Yeah, it's, just unpacking that is actually like a huge conversation.
Yeah, we could spend hours.
Right. I mean, it's like, because there is, like, what is it today versus like, what was it at 1910 when it was really having this huge influence on painting and art and abstraction, versus like, well, what are the different currents? If anybody, today the theosophists are kind of amazing, because they're like one of the few groups that seems to be able to like generate these like elaborate conspiracy theories coming from like both sides of the political spectrum, oftentimes about the same feature. So if anybody, I had literally never heard the word theosophy spoken out loud until I went into that building.
Wow.
And so, but Los Angeles ultimately turns out to be a center for all of these different like sectarian lines of the different groups that emerge out of that. And so they're all represented here in different ways, like contemporarily and historical.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what is it? You often will hear say, well, like it's something to do with Buddhism, or it's something to do with, Hinduism, or it's like, and that's definitely a part of it. But I think I just last week gave a talk at and like a gallery walkthrough talk as a part of the current Transcendental Painting Group exhibition that's at LACMA, and I had to kind of like figure out how to talk about this in 15 minutes or something.
Wow. Oh my
And
God.
so, in addition to talking about all this artwork, and so I think in some ways, it's a, the Theosophists are arguing that it's a mystical tradition. They're arguing that like mystical experience, right? The kind of like spiritual experience, although we all have a subjective, when that we experience that thing, it's very subjective, but whatever we are experiencing isn't subjective, like that there is like a common basis or a common reality. So in the same sense of the way that like, physics are the same no matter where you're from in the world, no matter who you are, right? Like it all works the same. Part of the argument that the Theosophists are making is that mystical experience is also the same as well. And then all of the different traditions that we think of from everywhere in the world, whether that's an early American tradition, whether that's a indigenous European tradition, whether that's a Southeast Asian Indian tradition, wherever you go, they're all sort of local expressions of that same idea.
Yes. I mean, to me, like, so we're speaking to this sense of like a universality of spirit, of sort of mystical experiences that like underneath the current of various metaphors or imagery, or like you say, like expressions within these various cultural contexts, there's an essence underlying that's all the same. You can think about that too in the context of like cultural mythology. Like when you're speaking, what comes to my mind is sort of the studies of like someone like Joseph Campbell, who's looking at sort of through the lens of like Carl Jung, like looking at mythology as like telling all these different cultures telling the same story, yes, using a little bit of different characters, little different sort of expressions based on that culture, but the essence of what they're telling, the stories they're telling, are all pointing to the same ideas. Is that sort of, would you say there's a parallel there in sort of like how we think about mystical experience, but also how we think about mythology, and how there is this sort of what Carl Jung termed as like the collective unconscious, which could be this sort of universal space of consciousness that all these expressions sort of derive their essence from? Would you agree with that? Like that sort of parallel?
Yeah, I think in the, yes, and to qualify it slightly, like, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to discover is that the entire academic field of comparative religion was created and pioneered by Theosophists. So the kind of line that Jung and Joseph Campbell are in, right? Like they're literally in that same academic. They're from the same source. I think the difference that like the important detail and of the sort of theosophical perspective is that like it's not saying that they're all the same, right? That like any one religion is the same as the other, or any one spirituality is the same as another. It's definitely aware and emphasizing that there are differences. But what it thinks is that they have a common source.
Yes.
And that's
there's like a common experience
exactly
that sort of like happened for, let's say, like various figures in major religious traditions, prophets, enlightened beings, avatars, however you want to describe them. They're all having this same experience. And as you may know firsthand, as I've had experiences, sort of mystical experiences through psychedelics or meditation, like there are no real words that you can use that can equal the experience. Like there's no way that you can sort of summarize and express the totality of what occurred within your heart, mind, and spirit in any way. Like it's so hard to express. That's why I think art exists in a lot of ways, because it's and all forms of art, because it's trying in some way to express the inexpressible through means that kind of subvert language in some sense, sometimes, depending on the type of art we're speaking about. But I find that like that to me makes a lot of sense. Like how do you make sense of something that is so like disorienting or like ungrounding in some way from like what you thought reality was? And therefore these figures who had these experiences will teach it in different ways, and based on the cultural conditions and traditions of a certain geographic location, it's going to find a whole new version of expression, which is where those differences ultimately come. To me, that makes a lot of sense, because I find myself on my own spiritual journey. I've always been very interested in other religious traditions. And I find the more I study them, the more I see like these threads back to this common source of like experiencing the non-dual, interdependent, infinite nature of consciousness itself. Um, and so for me, I get sometimes upset that like when religious people who are very religious in various ways have butt heads so much, like there is so much they have in common they don't even realize. And so sometimes I get frustrated by that. I feel like I can have an spiritual experience in a church, in a temple, in a mosque, in the woods, anywhere, because it's penetrating beyond the surface level distractions to the essence of what it means to be a conscious being in this infinite space and time. So I find that to be really special. Was there anything that you learned in your studies of theosophy that really like triggered some big opening in you or some big insight that kind of sort of changed the way you saw maybe art making or even just your own relationship to your inner life?
I think specifically in terms of my art making, the question was if we are, as artists able to make art about anything, and that we're sort of being educated in a sense to say that any kind of content is more or less equal, and we're engaged in a lot of ways in some kind of self-expression.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what it really, that to me I sort of became very dissatisfied with that idea. And I started to feel like, no, maybe as an artist, what I put in my art actually isn't all the same. There are qualitative differences about what my intention as an artist can be and what the message that I want to contain in my work is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like that this experience for me was really a lot about solidifying like, this is the content that I want in my work. And I think there is a qualitative difference about this kind of content versus anything else that could possibly put in there or nothing at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was definitely something that was very like, that was, I think, a very important affirmation.